to begin our exploration of Christian sacred art, we do have to begin prior to Christianity, and just with the realization that the great tradition of Christian sacred art extends back into the Old Covenant. And oftentimes we don't think of the Old Covenant as having art, as having material culture. We think of it as a religion of the Word, not a religion of the sacrament or ritual. But that's really just incorrect. And there's important reasons, historical reasons, why we have that perception, that we first have to address that, and then we can explore what does the Old Testament say about material culture and sacred art and its place in knowing the divine. So where does this perception come from that the Old Covenant religion was devoid of art? Because even a surface reading of the Old Testament completely, contradicts this. But where it comes from is really the fact that a lot of early biblical scholarship and subsequent biblical theology arose out of centers of Protestant Christian study. So Protestantism had, and still has, depends which brand of Protestantism, has a very anti-ritualistic bias to it. The ritual was pitted against a more spiritualized, internalized worship, and was seen as in competition. You couldn't have one or the other. You had to get rid of the ritualism and make the ritualism simpler, more colloquial, in order to get to this more authentic worship. So that's a very steeped part of Protestant theology that affected how these early scholars were reading the Old Testament. They devalued much of the ritual and artistic testimony in the Old Testament and relegated it to that which had been abrogated in the New Covenant. So it's very common in Protestant scholarship to see, Christ coming to fulfill the moral law, but to abrogate the ritual or liturgical practices of Israel. And on top of this anti-ritualistic bias, there was also a modernist bias. So the modernists tended to view religion as more about philosophy and ethics. So they really saw, all of these rituals and this liturgical praxis and this art as a more primitive stage of religion that religion needed to evolve out of into a more moral stage and a more philosophical stage. So even when Protestant scholarship did take seriously the ritual or liturgical tradition of the Old Testament, it was really, they saw it as something Israel, needed to move out of into the more sophisticated moral and ethical emphasis of the prophets. So they completely ignored prophets like Ezekiel, who have an intense ritualistic bent to him, and they didn't know how to interpret correctly the Mosaic tradition that integrates the ritual and the ethical because of this anti-ritualistic modernist bias. So in modernist biblical scholarship, they tended to dissolve all of that into ethics, and later they got rid of the philosophy too, because the idea was that philosophizing the faith was really a Hellenizing of the faith. So late modern Protestant scholarship, around the beginning of the 20th century, all they were really left with is an ethical religion, where the Bible is basically saying, be a nice, good person and do unto others. It's basically Kant's universal imperative, is what they saw in it. So by the beginning of the 20th century, it became clear, even in those circles of biblical scholarship, that if you approach the Old Testament in that sort of lens, you really don't have anything left to study. If you edit out all the ritual and all you have is this ethical emphasis, maybe you could study some parts of Jeremiah, but really that's it. I mean, so they had to reassess their fundamental biases. And today in biblical scholarship, the field is very different, where there's a rich exploration of the artistic, of the ritualistic, of the liturgical in the Old Testament, and how that is integral, is foundational to New Testament theology, particularly the theology of the Incarnation. So scholarship has moved a long way, but we still oftentimes carry these early biases influenced by Protestantism and modernism that would devalue the role of image in the Old Covenant, to where we don't even think of the Old Covenant as containing art, but indeed it was actually very central. You couldn't worship Yahweh correctly without ritual, without material culture, and eventually without art. So just to quote one of these biblical scholars, Walter Brueggemann, who's a contemporary scholar, actually a Protestant, but he is also a scholar who's very critical of reading these Protestant biases back into the text. And he, at least in this passage, writes very beautifully on the role of the visible and the role of material culture in Old Testament worship and Old Testament experience of God. So to quote a passage from his Theology of the Old Testament, Brueggemann says this: "What strikes one repeatedly in this exposition of the tabernacle, priesthood, mercy seat, and sacrificial system is the visual, material quality of everything that is authorized and proposed. Thus, at the outset, Yahweh commands Moses, in accordance with the pattern of the tabernacle and all its furnishings, so you shall make it. Moses and the workmen have available a model of their work. Moreover, the construction of the temple requires exotic materials and intense artistic skill. The tabernacle, all of the vessels of presence, are designed to appeal to the senses, and especially to the visual sensibility. This accent on the visual perhaps is the basis from which the pious in the Psalter imagine that they can see God. Psalms 11, verse 7, 17, verse 15, 36, verse 9, 63, verse 2. It may be that this rhetoric refers to a mystical, transcendent experience, but it seems more likely to me that what is intended is the vision of God mediated through the furnishings of presence, so that what is seen in the furniture from which the religious affirmation is extrapolated." So Brueggemann is saying that there's such an intense focus on God being visually present to the people in the temple, the tabernacle, all the furnishings, the ritual, that there's this whole piety of seeing God that is embedded within these temple songs. And Brueggemann, he notes that can be maybe a mystical vision that people are having, but it's really their experience of liturgy. And I would go further in the Christian tradition, or at least in the Orthodox tradition, we would never separate those two. The mystical vision is coterminous with the liturgically mediated vision of God. If you look at the great mystical theology of Dionysius the Areopagite, or Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, the liturgy, the sacramental order, is the primary analogy, is the primary location of the mystical vision. We never separate those two. So this is something that's steeped in the Old Testament, and you don't even understand the temple tradition or the Psalms or all these references to experiencing God that are so much of a central part of the worship of Israel, unless you understand it in this context of the visuality and the sensible presence of God mediated through the Old Testament cult. So the sheer weight of words and parchment and pages that are spent on the material culture in the Old Testament it's overwhelming. So to not view this as a central aspect of covenantal religion is really unacceptable. I mean, you have Exodus where Moses is commanded to build the tabernacle, but there's chapter upon chapter of description. Not only are there chapters upon chapters of what Moses sees in heaven to be the prototype of the temple, but then there's chapter upon chapter that exact prototype is being actualized in the material culture. And you go forward, there's chapter upon chapter of descriptions of the temple built in Jerusalem that is modeled after that tabernacle. And there's chapters upon chapters of the prophet Ezekiel describing the eschatological temple, and that's not even to mention the worship that goes on, which is also just rich in textual evidence. So to devalue this aspect of Old Covenant religion you just can't get away with it. And eventually Protestant scholarship did abandon that line of thinking and discovered or rediscovered things that as Orthodox Christians, as Apostolic Christians, has been a central part of our understanding of the Old Testament the whole time. So as we will see, as the church is exploring and answering the question, why is art central to our tradition, time and time again, it reaches directly to that Old Testament and says, no, this has always been a part of what we're doing as Christians. Just quickly focus in on that tabernacle and temple tradition and its material culture and what it was doing theologically. Scholars have long noted that what's described in the Old Testament with the temple is, for all intents and purposes, a very standard ancient Near Eastern temple. It has an outer courtyard. It has an outer altar where the sacrifices take place. So that's one thing to note that's very important in all ancient societies in the Near East and the Mediterranean world. So this would be true in Rome, just as true as it was in Egypt and in Babylonia, is that sacrifices were public events. They took place on a public exterior altar. The altars weren't inside typically the sacred building. There is an altar inside the temple in the holy place, not the Holy of Holies, but outside of that, there's an altar where incense was offered, but the main altar where the sacrificial animals were offered were on the outside of the temple. And it's really not until Christianity that we have an altar brought inside a sanctuary. And the fathers explore that theme of the altar was outside of the temple, just as Christ was sacrificed outside of the city of Jerusalem, outside of the walls. So even in the icon of the crucifixion, you'll often see behind Christ is the walls of Jerusalem, and that's referencing that idea that the sacrifice takes place outside these sacred precincts. And there's all kinds of theology as to why that's the case, how death can't coexist with the presence of God, who is life. And there's rich theology that we can even draw about the resurrection and what this means in Christianity. But we don't have time to explore that, at least in this presentation. But I will note that. So when we think of an ancient temple, that altar is on the outside in that courtyard area. Often this courtyard was, further extended by a garden precinct. And this was very, very common in Babylonia, where you needed this lush garden sort of atmosphere that the temple was placed in. Interestingly, that tradition too has been retained in the church. Churches used to have elaborate atriums and garden courtyards that would surround them. This is still part of the Ethiopian church that requires a forest around the church building. So this is a part of the Christian tradition that unfortunately has gone by the wayside. But back to the ancient temple, you have this outer courtyard, and then you have a portico, a porch or vestibule, and then beyond that you have these holy precincts where only the priests are allowed to minister and serve. So you have these progressive levels of sanctity that require progressive levels of what we would call sacerdotal initiation or different levels of the priesthood. So in the outer courts, you would have the Levites, who are this priestly caste, would serve, but in these inner courts, you would only have the priests proper, the Kohanim. And in that space, you would have things like the showbread, so bread that was left out as an offering to God, and also a token, a visible expression of his presence and provision. You would also have a great lamp, the menorah, that would always be lit, and that was a sign of intercession before God, or the people of God standing vigil before him. And then also in that space, you would have the great altar of incense, where the prayers of the people were offered in the form of incense. And beyond that, you had this transition. You had a great veil that marked the transition point between this holy space and the Holy of Holies. And that veil had certain iconography associated with it. It had certain colors that it had to be, red, violet, and blue. So very rich, very lavish even materials that made up this veil, and it had different images all throughout actually the temple complex. Cherubs, which were sort of guardian figures in the ancient Near Eastern religions. Also motifs like pomegranates and lions and various aspects of the cosmos. And then when you moved beyond that into the holy place proper, you would have the great Ark of the Covenant. So it was a gilded box, a golden box, and in it, later tradition would say is the, not just the Ten Commandments, not just the stone tablets of law. You would also have a jar of manna from heaven, and you would have, I believe, Aaron's rod. So Aaron, when they were trying to figure out which tribe of the Levites would be the priestly tribe, because before, originally it was just the firstborn of the tribe of Levi would be priests. Later that was changed to just a specific tribe of the Levites would be priests, the sons of Aaron, or that's why we call them the Aaronic priesthood. And to determine that, a miracle happened where Aaron's staff budded. It's just an old dried up stick of an almond wood, and it budded, an almond shoot, an almond flower, and an almond fruit. So that was the sign that he had been chosen, or his line had been chosen for the priesthood. So that was also there in that Ark of the Covenant. And upon the Ark of the Covenant was this great lid called the mercy seat. And on the mercy seat were graven images. That's the same word used in the Bible, carved images of the cherubim. And they spread their wings over the mercy seat, and they were gilded in gold, wood and carved, but gilded in gold. And what they covered, sometimes it's not clear as whether they covered it or it hovered above their wings, but what this was associated with was the visible, tangible presence of God, the Shekinah glory that dwelt in the temple, that only the high priest was allowed, and only once a year, and only after making sacrifices and oblations was the high priest even allowed into that area to make atonement for the people of God, which happened on the Day of Atonement, in Hebrew known as Yom Kippur. So what does all this mean? We don't really have time to go into each individual element, even though that's a study well worth doing, and there's lots of books and articles that do that. What I'll focus on is basically the larger meaning of what we believe is going on with these temple traditions, this tabernacle and later temple traditions. Biblical scholarship from a very early day noticed something interesting with how the Old Testament speaks of the creation of the temple. And it speaks, or the certain patterns, the literary patterns of the temple creation, whether it be the tabernacle in Exodus or the temple in the histories, the pattern, the cadence, the structure of these testimonies match exactly the pattern and cadence and structures of the creation of the cosmos itself. And if you just scratch right underneath the surface in the scriptures, you'll notice that link between cosmic creation and temple creation, it's really everywhere. I mean, even down to the words used for, Adam in the garden is supposed to keep and till the garden. Well, that's not even a good translation. It was to guard and keep, which were the priestly words. That was the charge of the Levites, and the charge of the priests in the temple were to keep and guard. Those are priestly words. So scholars noticed very early that there was this deep connection between temple worship and cosmic creation. And as I've said, Old Testament temple was almost identical in every respect except for one that we'll get to in a moment, to all the other Near Eastern or ancient temples. So too, when scholars started uncovering temple dedication documents, they realized that this connection between cosmic temple, creation of a temple, creation of the cosmos, was really part of the Near Eastern world view. So what we understand now, comparing all of this evidence, both biblical extra biblical dedication prayers, how the Egyptians, structured their temples. What we really believe is that what the temples represented was the cosmos. It was a microcosm of the entire universe, and that the whole universe was really present in microcosm in these temple structures, and that's what's being referenced. And when you break down the imagery of the temples, like some scholars do, that's what becomes immediately clear, is that all of created reality is represented in microcosm in the temple structures themselves. But the Israelite temple was different. It was very different, and one of the most significant and radical ways that a temple could be different in the ancient world. And all temples had a central cult image that was kept in that Holy of Holies. So in the Egyptian temples, you would go through all these series of inner or outer courts and inner courts, and finally the Holy of Holies was a very small place that only the cult image of the deity or deities was kept. It was the same in the Babylonian traditions. It was the same in the Greco-Roman traditions. So the great, statues of Athena or Zeus, those were kept in the Holy of Holies and almost inaccessible. Later, as they became larger, the buildings had to become larger to house them. It became more accessible, where you could go see these statues, but the idea was there that these temples were there to enshrine and house this cult image. And of course, the Old Testament religion has no such image. It has this wonderful matrix, this symbolic matrix of visuality, but there's something conspicuously absent, and that was meant to be conspicuously absent. It was radically different than any other temple in the ancient world until really Zarathustra and later Persian religion that also didn't have a cult image, but just fire. But this is prior to even that. The Old Testament religion didn't have an image of God. And this will come up time and time again in the theology of the icon and as the fathers are exploring the Old Covenant. But just to prefigure, to preshadow what's going on, the Old Testament gives a very specific reason why there is no image of God in the temple tradition. And it's because God didn't reveal any form of himself when he gave Moses the revelation of the tabernacle. And it's very straightforward if you just read scripture, on a surface level. Well, why didn't God reveal an image to Moses? Well, if we flip back, a few chapters, a few books earlier, we have the great creation stories in the book of Genesis. And what does God identify as his image? Well, it's none other than human beings, men and women made in the image and likeness of God. So God didn't reveal an image to Moses on Sinai, wherein Old Testament religion could be, modeled off of and have a cult image, because he already had a cult image, and it was man himself. And this theme has been richly explored, again, by contemporary biblical scholarship. Some scholars have even noticed that there's a real parallel if you look at the temple dedication rituals and the book of Genesis. So in these temple dedications, you have this whole elaborate process of building cosmos, of building temple. Starts with garden, ends with temple, with outer sanctuary, and then the Holy of Holies. And the final stage, the final process of this temple creation is the solemn installation of the divine image. And of course, that's the final stage, the final process of creation in the Old Testament, the book of Genesis, is Adam, this image and likeness of God. So biblical scholars really do see this symmetry between this temple creation, the installment of the divine image, and God's cosmic creation, and the creation and installment of his living image in the cosmos. Again, just to cite some biblical scholars that work in this field and draw some of these beautiful symmetries and parallels and what what Genesis is really trying to say about the image of God. Actually, probably can't quote John Walton, but I encourage you to look into the work of John Walton, who speaks very eloquently on this, but I'll quote G.K. Bailey. And here he's talking about this ritual installment of the divine image and its parallels to the book of Genesis. And Bailey says this in reference to this parallel between the Mesopotamian installment and the book of Genesis. So in the Mesopotamian installment, the creation, animation, and installation of divine images followed a strictly specified set of rites. A series of rituals were acted out in the workshops of the craftsmen, at the riverbank, in the arboreal garden, and finally in the temple. Through the rituals, the inert image of the god was born, brought to life, clothed and changed into a living manifestation of the god. The image was then installed in the temple. Likewise, God formed Adam in his workshop, Genesis 2:7a. He was transmuted into a living person by God's breath, Genesis 2:7b, and was fully brought to life, Genesis 2:7c. Next was installed in the garden, Genesis 2:15. Such a background suggests further that Adam was a living image of the true God, not a false pagan deity, and as such was placed into the garden temple. As an image of the true God, in contrast to ancient Near Eastern priest kings, Adam's royal and priestly service in the Eden temple and his temple-expanding task also find further striking parallels in ancient Near Eastern literature. Again, these similarities are only imperfect shadows of the genuine task described by God in Genesis 1 and 2. With regard to Adam's role as a human priest-king, the notion of a human king created for the purpose of serving the gods in a temple appears in an Akkadian prayer employed in dedicating the foundation stone of the temple. So he goes on and on, showing these striking parallels between cosmic creation, temple creation, installment of the divine image, installment of Adam, the role of the king as priest, Adam's priestly and kingly role in the cosmos, and all of this is kind of brought together in this beautiful biblical theology. It's now becoming very clear in particularly New Testament scholarship that this idea of the visual presence of God in the tabernacle is really the foundation of New Testament Christology. I'm thinking of both the Christology of the Gospel of John and also St. Paul's, the Christology that he explores in his letters. So to go to the Gospel of John, the Gospel of John opens with that great prologue, and in that he speaks of the Word, who is God, tabernacling amongst us. And that word tabernacling, again, it goes all the way back to that Old Testament image of the presence of God being present to his people in the tabernacle itself. But that word is actually very interesting because it means tabernacle, which is a fancy word for tent. But tents in the ancient world were also made out of skin. So there's an etymological connection between the word tabernacling and skin, like he casts a skin of flesh amongst us. And that's really where we get this whole theology of incarnation from. So even there's a linguistic connection that St. John is exploring, and that will be further drawn out throughout the rest of his gospel, where it culminates, with that famous incident where the apostle Philip, almost out of exasperation towards the end of Christ's ministry, and says, Jesus, just show us the Father. We just want to see a vision of the Shekinah glory, and then we're good. And Christ, of course, tells Philip, Philip, how long have I been with you, and you still don't get it? If you have seen me, you have seen the Father. And contemporary biblical scholarship really sees in all of this temple, or all of this language of the visibility of the divine in Christ, rooted in these concepts of the visibility of God in the tabernacle. This is God tabernacling now amongst us. And the same leitmotif is taken up again with St. Paul, who draws those parallels between, Adam being called to the image and likeness of God, but failing, in that charge, still retaining the image, but falling short of the likeness. Like, we can no longer look at the human being and say, oh yeah, that's what God is like. But St. Paul points out that Christ, as that new Adam now, is the image and likeness of God in that famous passage from the book of Colossians 1:15, which actually biblical scholars believe that's not St. Paul's creation. He's quoting a hymn, the liturgy of the church that he's received as tradition, and he says, Christ is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of the creation, and the firstborn of the new creation, the first risen from the dead. So just as Adam was that firstborn son of God of the old dispensation, now Christ is that firstborn from that old dispensation that's bound to death into the new, into the resurrected life. And he redeems humanity's image capacity. We can really look at, to go back to St. John's theology, we can really look at Christ and say, okay, now we can say we know what God is like. So all of this Christological theology that we find in the New Testament rests on that foundation. And this is even, when you look at the fathers, I'm thinking particularly of St. Athanasius and his responses to Arianism, time and time again. I had it somewhere to quote, but it's all over his writings. He's constantly going back to that temple, that the temple contained the Shekinah. You can't separate the flesh from the divinity of Christ, that they're integrated, and he time and time again goes into the New Testament and roots it all the way back into those temple imagery, that temple imagery of Christ being the image of God, because he is the temple of God, because he is the new Adam, because he is that cult image that couldn't be installed because we don't worship dead things. We as the prophet Jeremiah wonderfully has all these very humorous anti-pagan passages. We don't worship dead wood and dead stone. The image of God for us can only be a fully realized human being. So that's where all of that New Testament theology comes from, is that Old Testament theology of not only is there a divine image, it's the image of human beings doing what God does, and not only in the Old Testament there absolutely is a material culture, and that material culture, rather than being abrogated in the New Covenant, is fulfilled. It's made complete in the New Covenant, and we would say in particular in the aspects of New Covenant life that involve our worship. We need a worship space. We use matter in our encounter with God. Theologians would call this the sacramental economy. We can't even come into communion with God without water, without being baptized, and we enter into full unity with Christ when he extends his presence into matter in the materiality of the Eucharist. And all of this is housed within a material culture. There's that famous passage, that's sort of the Magna Carta, really, of all sacred art, all Christian material culture, where Christ tells the disciples, go prepare a place for me to celebrate the Passover. This divine command that there needs to be some kind of preparation for a ritual wherein Christ is fully given. So that's part of our tradition, and it's because it was part of that old covenant tradition. In some ways, Christianity is a better continuation of Old Testament religion than eventual Judaism would become. Judaism, of course, after the Romans destroyed the temple in 70 AD, had no more access to its ritual tradition. It literally cannot perform most of its religion, and that's why it's thought of as a moral and philosophical or intellectual endeavor. It's because there's no ability to fulfill this aspect. But in Christianity, as the true and legitimate successor to that old covenant religion, that is part of our tradition. We've maintained both the temple and the Torah, the intellectual aspect, whereas Judaism can't fulfill the temple aspect of its own tradition. So lastly, I will touch on one of the other central aspects of Old Covenant presentation of material culture, and that is the ban on idolatry. So it's absolutely forbidden for the people of God to participate in the ritual or material culture of these pagan religions. But as I think I've hopefully demonstrated, is that we can't simply equate the production and ritual use of sacred art and idolatry. Scripture talks about both. It commands the one and forbids the other. So we can't make that direct equation, which is so often done in people who look at art, sacred art as inherently idolatrous. You can't make that equation. The scriptures make it clear that you can't make that equation. So what is the essence of idolatry then? Well, if you read the Old Covenant, they actually make it very clear that idolatry is when you're attributing divinity to a created reality. So it's not that it's pagan worship. It's pagan worship because it's false worship. It's not authorized worship. It's not worshiping the true God. It's worshiping something else, particularly another spiritual being. The scriptures make it clear that these pagan deities, they're not just ideas, they're not just mind viruses, they are actually spiritual beings in and of themselves. They're what we call demons. But even if we were to look at it on a purely, let's say, psychological level, as sort of, a Jungian projection of an ideal archetype, look at something like Apollo, which is really an ideal human being, an ideal man, fit physically, fit mentally. He's basically the greatest expression that can be conceptualized of a human being. And it would seem reasonable for the ancients to worship him, to ascribe worship to him, to honor him as that pinnacle. But what the scriptures are trying to say is that even the best of the best is still not the transcendent reality that is God. And what happens when you do that? What happens when your ultimate goal falls short of the transcendent good and stops at even, the best of all goods, but still not infinite good, as St. Gregory of Nyssa would say? What happens, you think you're magnifying this created reality, but you're not. Your all created reality is pointed to be fulfilled, to have its fullness, its culmination in its communion with God. Reality or the human person can't fulfill themselves in and of themselves. The fathers time and time again use this to explain even the nature of the fall itself. Why did Adam eat? Why was his sin to eat? Why was disobeying, materialized in him trying to fill his nature? He was trying to become fully human, which meant being divinized by a material means, by making full his material nature. But that can't be done. So human beings are that strange created being that can't be filled outside of a relationship with God. We can't come to the fullness of our nature on our own, and that's what idolatry is trying to do. It's basically fulfilling human being without God and using material or less than divine means to do that, and ascribing to these things a divinity that they simply don't and can't have. So we think we're fulfilling our nature, but we're not. We're actually creating this kind of feedback loop where yeah, maybe some positive things are being amplified, but all the negative, all the brokenness of our fallen image is likewise being amplified. And St. Paul really draws this out in the first letter, or he only wrote one letter, the first chapter of the letter to the Romans, where he explains this connection between idolatry and immorality, and particularly sexual immorality. It's immorality that attacks at the heart of the human person and at the heart of the human person's imageness to God, which is male and female coming together. So that starts to decompose quicker, or first before everything else. And we see that whole pattern in the Old Testament as well, where this idolatry, it's always described with the analogy of harlotry, and it attacks the firstborn. It subverts this marital relationship. So this is all steeped in the Old Testament, this connection between idolatry and immorality. And it's really only we as moderns that separate worship from ethics. Worship and ethics are really the same thing. We can't separate the two. There's this beautiful passage. Let me see if I can. This beautiful passage of St. Ephrem the Syrian in his Hymns on Paradise, where he kind of draws all of this together, and he talks about Adam as the priest king in the Edenic temple. And he says this: God did not permit Adam to enter the inmost tabernacle. This was withheld, so that first he might prove pleasing in the service of that outer tabernacle. Like a priest with fragrant incense, Adam's keeping of the commandments was to be his censer. Then he might enter before the hidden one into the hidden tabernacle. So all throughout the Fathers, all throughout the doctrine of the Church, we see that there really is no separation between worship and ethics. So that's what happens with idolatry. Its connection to immorality is really baked into the very nature of the human being. That's why it comes first in the commandments. And then, the commandments, they all kind of cascade on one another. If we don't get the first ones right, we don't get the rest of them right. So again, we can't reduce religion as those modernists would to simple ethics, or, in our own day to sort of reducing religion to a social policy or an economic system or a political ideology. That's fundamentally idolatrous. That's what it is. It's collapsing grace into nature and believing that we can fulfill nature by nature in and of itself, which is an impossibility. That's really the essence of idolatry. So again, we can't go too fully into that, but I will throw that out there because that is a fundamental part of how the Old Covenant deals with material culture. But again, it's not because material culture is bad. It's because there's a pronounced difference between authorized material culture and unauthorized, erroneous, idolatrous religious material culture. One leads to life and covenantal union, and the other leads very quickly, very directly to immorality and ultimately to death.